Energy media readers, today we're going to be talking about true and false in energy issues. Always a contentious topic, and I'd like to welcome Shawn McCarthy, energy journalist extraordinaire, to the interview.
Hi, Markham. How are you?
Good, Shawn. How are you?
Great, great.
Look, the Canadian Energy Centre, also known as the Energy War Room, launched a couple of weeks ago. And CEO Tom Olson, who's a former Post-Media columnist and also worked as a communications director for Premier Ed Stelmach in Alberta, he's the CEO. And he wrote a column that said, the one line really stuck out for me, that the War Room will reject the false and promote the true. Promote what is true. Energy issues are mostly Byzantine in their complexity and don't, in my opinion, lend themselves to a true false binary, sort of a outlook. You're a veteran energy reporter. What's your take on it?
Well, as having been a reporter in the sector for a long time, I like to think that there are facts that you can rely on. I used to hear from the industry on a regular basis that you can have your own opinion. You're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. As it turns out, you are entitled to your own facts, and any lawyer will tell you that. You can pull facts out that give one story, and you can pull facts out that give a whole different story. You leave out the facts that are inconvenient to your argument, and you include only the facts that are convenient to your argument. And some of the facts, frankly, that we've seen from the War Room to date are somewhat misleading, I would say.
Let me give you an example of what I think is true in a news story. So I did an interview yesterday with a researcher at the University of Calgary. We were talking about methane emissions and Canadian LNG exports. Right. And this fellow had co-authored a paper that was the most comprehensive review of methane emissions from the wellhead to the generating plants in Asia. Right. And what he said at the end of the day, he said, with the technology we have to collect the data, and with the technology we have, I can say that I have high confidence that the Canadian natural gas, Canadian LNG would lower emissions in China if it was displaced coal. Right. With the caveats, of course.
Yeah,
and
lots caveats
are everything. And I thought that's an example of fair and true in an energy story. We can accept that with the caveats. Very seldom see statements with caveats like that. And I don't know, what's your take?
Well, that's absolutely right. So you take a cautious academic statement that is full of, if you assume this and if you assume that, and at the other end, if you assume that, then we can say it will lower emissions. You strip out all the ifs and you're left with a bald statement that is only true in certain circumstances and can be untrue in as many circumstances as it is true in other circumstances. So, you have to be very careful about those caveats. They mean something. They're important. The ifs mean that if you're not collecting the methane at the front end, you get a completely different result than if you are. So, the other one is the famous IEA forecast, which maybe we can get into, and it's not a forecast, by the way, it's a scenario. But they use the industry and the War Room use it to suggest that demand for oil and gas is going to grow forever, and we know that it's an IEA scenario that assumes no further policy development on climate change, nothing new other than what's stated policy as of 2019, and that's what's the basis of the forecast. The IEA isn't saying that's what's going to occur. They're saying if you assume this, then you will get that. Again, stripping out the if matters.
I'm glad you brought that up because I interviewed Tim Gould from the IEA, who actually looks after their modeling, and he made it really clear. In fact, he said, we don't do long-term forecasts.
No, it's not.
He said, we forecast for 5 years. Anything else after that is scenarios, not scenarios. And so you brought up the stated policy scenario, and of course, there's the sustainable development scenario that sees oil consumption drop by 35 million barrels a day by 2040. That's a very different world for Canadian oil exporters than the stated policies that the CAP and the other organizations, industry organizations use. Well, give
Absolutely.
me, have you
when you're looking at infrastructure that's supposed to last for 30, 40 years, pipelines and new oil sands projects, that matters.
Exactly right. And I've taken CAP to task on that in any number of columns. Have you got an example from your days when you were doing energy reporting where you came up against this problem of qualified answers, caveats, things that you suspected maybe weren't quite accurate?
Well, many times. And frankly, it's not just the industry, in fairness. Their critics sometimes strip out the ifs and the caveats as well and make claims that can't be substantiated. Our job as journalists is to test them all against whatever fact and data we can find. The one that we see very often is the claim that they brought down emissions in the oil sands, and a couple of caveats there. That one is it's just wrong unless you say we brought down emissions per barrel for projects. Then they can make a case that for every barrel of oil they produce, they've reduced emissions somewhat. But it's not true that overall emissions have come down. It's not true that it's particularly clean. They talk about the oil being clean oil from Alberta. If they mean low carbon, it's not, even if they brought down the emissions to some degree. And so that's a good example where the wording, if you are very precise and include the caveats, it is true. But when you strip away the caveats and make it a bold statement, we have reduced emissions in the oil sands, it's absolutely not true.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the industry's critics doing the same thing, because that is true. And I have taken the National Observer and the Tyee to task a number of times on this. And there are any number of examples. They quote economists who are not energy economists who make mistakes on their calculations of profitability of Trans Mountain expansion pipeline, for instance, that sort of thing.
Right.
But I'm wondering from your point of view. Hang on a second, Shawn. We're going to edit this out. I had a question in my head, and I can't remember what it was now.
Yep.
It was a really good question.
It was a good one.
You and I are probably about the same age. Do you find that every once in a while the train of thought leaves the station, but it always comes back around?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I don't know how I'd have to do if I had to do live TV, I'd be in trouble.
But yeah, it's hard to do the interview where you're engaging with the person, and then the question is there, but you're listening as you should be, and so yeah, all the time.
And it disappears, but it'll come back. I know it always does. So I'm trying to think of that question.
Talking about the other side, the Tyee and the National Observer, and some of their false statements or misleading statements. I mean, you could get into just and you did off the top, what a morass this is. I mean, to separate out opinion and fact can be very difficult.
You know what? I think that was exactly the question I was going to talk about complexity.
Yeah.
Shawn, in my reporting, one of the things I can say with some certainty is that almost every energy issue I report on, whether it is the energy transition and climate policy on the clean energy side, or it's pipelines, oil sands, and so on the hydrocarbon side, every one of these issues is very, very complex. And when you were reporting and were dealing with these kinds of stories, how did you handle that complexity?
Well, that's frankly the biggest challenge that we face when we're, a beat reporter covering an issue like this, because, for the average reader, viewer, you really can't get too deeply into the weeds because, it's just so complex, you lose people. And so the challenge is to tell it accurately. We talked about losing all the caveats, and as journalists, we can't do that either. So you have to sort of sometimes back up a little bit and just have an explainer paragraph in your story as to what exactly you mean by that. I probably, writing for the Report on Business, assumed a little bit more than I maybe even should have, that people were somewhat familiar with the concepts. But it is amazing when you talk to people, the lack of economic and energy literacy. And frankly, that's one of the areas I think that industry and the environmental community can agree. It would be much better for the debate if there was a lot more literacy around these issues, a lot more familiarity, so that one person isn't talking Latin and the other person talking Greek, and it's you can't have a conversation that way.
I'm of the opinion that the Canadian public will never know any more about the technical aspects of energy issues than they do today. I don't care how much industry or the environmental groups. Yeah, I just don't. I don't see it happening. But I did interview a reader today who had a very interesting take on it, because he came out of I think it was the IT industry, and he said, "Look, whenever I come to any news story, but particularly energy stories, I have a filter, and I consciously engage the filter. And the filter has different components. So he might say, which media organization, who is the reporter or columnist. Right. I want to look in the story and see who the sources are. Does it rely on studies and data and other sort of reliable forms of information? And he says, once I process that, initially through the filter, then I can make a determination for myself whether I think that is a reliable story, and whether I want to proceed further, and whether I'm going to accept the arguments and so on that are made in it. Your take?
Well, I mean, that's great, and I would love to have a reader like that. We all cherish those readers who spend some time trying to understand. Truth is, while there are plenty of engaged readers out there, the audience is bigger than that, and people don't have time to engage, and people are busy. Intelligent, committed people are busy with their lives, and want an accurate, digestible take on the big issues of the day. And that was my job when I was still writing for the Globe and Mail. And I try to keep it up now with some freelance writing, but really that is the challenge. You cannot rely on, to some degree, if you're a niche market, you can rely on the engaged reader, but for, a broad market, mainstream audience, you have to assume a certain, they tell us like an 8th grade reading level really is what you're talking about. And again, I always assumed a little more than that, but people who are very intelligent, committed, might be absolute geniuses in their particular line of business that's not energy, still need help understanding the energy business, as the energy executive would need help understanding the healthcare business.
Right. So on the website of the Canadian Energy Centre, there's an interview with Professor Leanne Lefsrud from the University of Alberta, who does work on energy narratives. And I've interviewed her a couple times. She's first rate, and really enjoy her insights. And the point of the tweet was that there's too much anger and divisiveness and so on being thrown around, and we should all just kind of chill. And then I think about the Canadian Energy Centre, the Kenny government, the industry, and you referenced a couple of CAP tweets that are representative of what they do. And I can't help but think that, in fact, it's government and industry, the pro-governments and the industry, that have really ramped up a lot of this hysteria and the anger and the divisiveness. And could you comment from your point of view, this has been in the industry for a while,
Right.
what's today like compared to 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago?
Well, certainly it's way more divisive, no question about it. I mean, when I started covering the industry for the Globe and Mail, not even that long ago, I came back to it full time 15 years ago. Pipelines were boring, right? I mean, that was back of the book kind of dividend stories. And so, the first Keystone pipeline went through virtually without a peep. Climate change and some fairly major pipeline and oil spells, the big one in Michigan by Enbridge and of course the BP in the Gulf changed all that. And people now see their world threatened by the production of fossil fuels and the emissions that come from them. So sure, it's divisive, and I would say absolutely the critics of the industry have attacked it with a great deal of emotionalism. There's no question about that. And they were caught off guard, and they responded with the same degree of emotionalism, but I mean, they were busy doing their business without much in the way until 10 years or so ago. So it came on them fairly suddenly. So absolutely, there's a lot of emotion and divisiveness and reaction. I was on a panel recently, moderating a panel that was trying to get beyond the polarization to talk about energy issues, and you can, but I got to say, the extremes of the debate were not represented on that panel. It was a pretty congenial bunch, and they weren't taking on some of the really thorny issues. And if you're in Alberta and you rely on the oil industry for your livelihood, of course you're concerned. But if you're also paying attention to climate change and you're concerned about the future of our climate and the world and the impacts it will have, you're absolutely concerned. I know young people who don't want to have children because of their fear about the future and the dystopia around climate change. So this is an issue that is just fraught, politically, emotionally. People choose their own. We have these echo chambers around the world view that wasn't the case probably 20 years ago with the the polarization of the media. So it all feeds into a really absolutely emotional debate where people will cut shortcuts around the truth in order to issue a polemic.
I have to tell you, Shawn, I've kind of made my peace with the divisive nature of the debate.
Well, that's good, because it's going to be around for a long time.
That's exactly right. There is no putting that genie back in the bottle for a long, long time, and therefore we may as well engage it and have a strategy to engage. And that gets us back then to this idea of rejecting the false and what's false and promoting what's true. Yeah. And on my Twitter profile, I say my obligation, my goal is to be accurate and to tell the truth, and full stop. That's all. I don't talk about bias. I don't talk about any of that. Just accurate and truthful. And I think that is, from my point of view, the only rational response to all this divisiveness. What do you take? What do you say?
Well, yeah, I think you have to, and I think I give you full marks for trying for taking that tack. But I'm sure that there are people who will listen to you on a regular basis and find that your version of the truth is somewhat lacking because of your outlook on things. I tend more to want to talk about the facts than the truth, because I think the truth is elusive. And the old everything is relative, man, there's a certain amount of truth to that. And the irony is the right has picked up on that the left used to really peddle this idea of the postmodern world, right, where truth is very elusive. So, I applaud, and I tried to go after the truth myself as a journalist, and I still look for it and try to communicate it. But I think, I also am humble enough to realize that my grasp of the truth is tenuous, and what I'm really at, what I can offer, I think, more than truth is facts.
And I think maybe that's the thing we need to do as we this interview draws to its conclusion, is our takeaway from this is maybe that we stop talking about truth. There is no such thing as truth per se. It's facts. And give me the facts, ma'am, and that's it. And maybe in a way we go back to, some very basic journalism principles.
Yeah, I mean, we can save the debate about what is truth for the philosophy class, which I love and I'm happy to do, but it's in a way for me, it's another conversation.
Yes, indeed. And that's one of the reasons why I flag this, is because, of course, now we have the Canadian Energy Centre talking about promoting the truth. It almost sounds a bit Orwellian.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I don't mean to be overly cynical about the Canadian Energy Centre, but they have a mandate, and their mandate is not to get at the truth. The mandate is to defend the industry. And so when that's your main mandate, the truth gets pretty slippery.
Shawn, thank you very much for this. Always appreciate your insights. Look forward to the next one. Thank you.
All right. Talk to you later.